is there a danger of being too formal or formulaic when mooting?
I think it's difficult to be too, well, I mean, obviously you don't want to be too formulaic and come across robotic, I think is maybe the point. But I don't think there's anything wrong with signposting or obviously informing the court of that you're moving on to the next point. I think that's the right and proper way to do it. And those kind of formalities, at least in a moot, you might not necessarily do them in court. I wouldn't necessarily do that if I was doing, say, an application to exclude a certain piece of evidence. At every step of the way, probably be a bit more natural. But when it comes to a moot, of course, there is a certain marking criteria. And of course, being able to comply with the formalities and understand the formalities of the court, I think is always a good thing. I think it shows that you're really paying attention to the details, the little details, that you're not just thinking about the big picture submissions, but you're also going slightly further and picking up on how you can make it as easy as possible for the judge to follow you, and also as accessible for the judge to hear your submissions. I think I take the phrasing of that question, formulaic, to mean, of course, you don't want your advocacy to become, as I said, robotic. You don't want it to become, you don't want the formalities to get in the way of what you're actually trying to say. So if you're wasting lots and lots of time dealing with citations and page references, try and cut back as much as you can, as much as you reasonably can, and focus on the actual submissions. But it's a balancing act, of course, because at the end of the day, as much as advocacy is subjective, I think judging is as well. And some judges will tend to gravitate more towards formality than others. And that's just a natural part of it. Everyone has their own individual preferences. And I think you've just got to be aware of how much you can comply with the formalities to show that you've got that mooting ability, whilst at the same time being able to actually get to your point. And actually make your submission.
Thanks, Jazz. And
I think that's it. Sorry, John. I think that's it. It depends on the tribunal. You know, some tribunals will want you to be more formal than others, and you know, sometimes you just want to get straight to the point. But I think with mooting, you do have to accept that there is a degree of formality that's perhaps expected over and above general advocacy in practice. And that is part of it, as Jazz says, that's the marking criteria. You've got to tick those boxes to get the points, as it were. But I think it's also worth noting that you will make mistakes with that formal approach along the way, but that's not necessarily a bad thing, I would say. I mean, you can develop and practice those formal techniques, and they don't really come naturally to any of us. I mean, no one starts most of the things they say with "may it please" whoever you're talking to. But once you get to grips with that and you start getting comfortable with the language and getting comfortable with the structures, then you can start to rein it back. So I think don't be afraid to make mistakes early. I certainly did, and I've been told many times, you know, that was too formal or that lacked formality, and you have to experiment and find your own way. But I think it's part of the process of developing those mooting skills is to make those mistakes. And if anything, it's probably best to be slightly overly formal. But as soon as, for example, the court says, well, you don't need to bother with citations, take that on board. Don't keep hammering the same point. Once you get the idea that they're not with you on something in your style, change it very quickly. And again, that goes back to the versatility thing.
Thanks, Robert. Beth, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I completely agree with what's been said already. I think with formality, there's always a danger of swinging too far either way, either being far too formal or not formal enough to the point where the tribunal actually find you coming across as rude as an advocate, which it would always be preferable to be too formal than to go too far the other way. I think in terms of the signposting in particular, it really depends on how complex your points are and how complex your structure is. If you're only making 3 main submissions, it's probably not necessary to be as formulaic as if you've got 4 submissions within 3 grounds, for example. Signposting is all about helping the judge to follow where you are. And I think it's very context-based. I don't think there can be a hard and fast rule on that.
Yeah, completely agree. I'd agree with all of the advice there. And I think the thing to remember is that with mooting or any form of advocacy, it's about trying to be persuasive. So, you know, if you're worried when it comes to being formulaic about point 1 is, point 2 is, I think you're going to bore the judge quite quickly. what you really want to do is, use the skeleton argument to your advantage. So if there's a particular point in the skeleton argument that's going to support your argument, then bring the judge back to it, refer the judge back to the skeleton arguments at that stage. But don't worry too much about saying, I'm now moving on to point 3. Let me begin this. So, you need to, it needs to be almost conversational, but maintaining the formality that's required for mooting.
I was just about to say that, John, I totally agree. You're there to have a conversation with the judge, not to give a speech.
Yeah.
And I think once you get to grips with that, and that certainly took me some time, because you prepare your submissions and you just want to deliver them. And if anything, when the court asks you a question, you think, especially in the time pressure of mooting, you think, oh, for goodness sake, I just want to get to the end of my speech, and you're wasting my time in asking these questions. It's completely the wrong way of looking at it. When they ask you a question, it's because they want to know the answer, and it's a helpful way of developing your arguments from that point of view. But you're there to have a conversation, not to give a speech.
Completely agree. Great advice there.